She trusted him completely. That's the thing that stays with me. That's the thing I think about at 3 in the morning when the apartment is quiet and the city outside is doing its strange post-contact thing. All those lights still burning because half the planet can't sleep anymore, not really, not since they came. I think about how completely she trusted him. How she would tilt her head slightly when he spoke, those 3 silver irises contracting a little, like she was not just hearing the words but tasting them, checking them for honesty the way you'd press a thumb into fruit to test its ripeness. She never found anything wrong. She never knew what he was. And I was standing 4 feet away for most of it. That was my job. That was the specific, terrible, necessary job I had been given, to stand close enough to watch, far enough not to interfere, and to carry in my chest the full weight of what was actually happening in that room. Let me start from the beginning, or close to it, because the real beginning, was not the summit. The real beginning was a Tuesday in March, 8 months before the Velarath delegation arrived, when I was called into an underground conference room in Geneva and shown a photograph of a man named Declan O'Brien, and told that he was going to be the most important human being on Earth for approximately 72 hours, and that almost no one could ever know why. Declan O'Brien. I want you to hold that name for a moment, because it's not the kind of name that sounds like it belongs to power. It doesn't have the architecture of importance. It doesn't land in the ear the way General something or Secretary something does. It sounds like a man who fixes boats in a harbor town on the Irish coast, which, for the first 31 years of his life, is more or less what his family did. He was 43 when I met him, medium height, the kind of build that suggested he'd been athletic once and hadn't entirely let it go. Brown hair going gray at the temples in an uneven way, like frost forming on a window without any particular plan. He had a habit of rubbing the knuckle of his left thumb against his lower lip when he was thinking, and he thought constantly. You could always tell because his eyes would go slightly unfocused and distant even while the rest of his face stayed present and engaged. His official designation was Senior Cultural Linguistics Specialist, Xenocommunications Division, United Earth Contact Bureau. His unofficial designation, the one that existed in 3 documents, all stored on air-gapped servers in 3 separate locations on 3 separate continents, was Supreme Executor, Contingency Epic Protocol. I'll explain what that means, or I'll try. Some of it I still don't fully understand myself, and I was one of maybe 40 humans on Earth who was told the whole picture. The Velarath had made contact 22 months before the summit. Not the way the films always showed it, not a shadow falling across a city, not a beam of light, not a ship the size of a continent hovering over a coastline while every camera on Earth pointed upward. It was quieter than that. It was a signal received by the Deep Space Monitoring Array in New Mexico, decoded over 11 days by a rotating team of mathematicians and linguists working in shifts, and then confirmed by a second array in Kazakhstan and a third relay station that we had quietly positioned out past the Jovian Belt 3 years earlier, which officially did not exist. The signal said, in essence, "We are coming. We mean no harm. We would like to speak." What it did not say, what we only learned later in fragments, through the painstaking early work of the Contact Bureau's linguistics teams, was who was coming, or why they had chosen now, or what speak meant to a civilization that had been operating for somewhere between 800,000 and 2 million years, depending on which part of their calendar system you were translating. The Velarath were not the first alien species humanity had confirmed. They were the third, but they were the first to come here in person with a physical delegation. The other 2, the Caliph and the Yundara, had made contact only through signal, and both relationships were still in what the Secretariat called the correspondence phase, which was diplomatic language, for we are exchanging extremely careful messages, and trying very hard not to accidentally say anything that causes an interstellar incident. The Velarath wanted to come in person. They wanted to sit across from us. They wanted, as best we could translate it, something that mapped roughly onto the human concept of looking someone in the eyes. That should have been straightforwardly wonderful. In a lot of ways, it was. But it also meant something that the Secretariat's Threat Assessment Division had been quietly terrified about for the entire 22 months since first contact. It meant we needed a translator. Not just any translator. The Velarath language, Velaric, the Contact Bureau's linguists had started calling it, though the Velarath themselves had what sounded like 17 different words for the concept of their own language, depending on context and speaker, was not a language that could be learned in the way you learn French or Mandarin or Arabic. It wasn't a question of vocabulary and grammar. The Velarath communicated in a layered system that combined auditory signal, subsonic harmonic undertone, and what the linguistics team eventually concluded was a form of bioelectric field modulation, a kind of emotional broadcast that accompanied the words and was, in Velarath culture, considered part of the words, not subtext, not tone. Actual syntactic content. If you spoke Velaric without the harmonic layer, you were speaking in broken sentences. You were leaving out entire portions of meaning. If you spoke Velaric without the bioelectric component, the emotional broadcast, you were being, by Velarath standards, either profoundly rude or actively deceptive, depending on the situation, because you were communicating words without their corresponding truth weight. In Velarath culture, deliberately separating your words from your emotional broadcast was what humans might call lying, except worse. It was lying that announced itself as lying, which somehow made it more offensive, not less. Like looking someone in the face and saying, "I am now going to deceive you," and then doing it anyway. Humans couldn't produce the bioelectric component. We didn't have the biology for it. What we had, after 16 months of work by a team of 70 scientists and linguists that the world didn't know existed, was Declan O'Brien. I have to be careful here about what I say, because some of the technical details are still restricted, and because even the details I'm allowed to share are ones that most people, hearing them, feel an instinctive resistance to. A kind of that can't-be-real reflex that I understand completely, because I had the same reflex when they first showed me the research. Declan had a neurological profile that the team's lead biophysicist described as the most precisely calibrated human nervous system we have ever documented. He had been identified by a low-key screening program the Contact Bureau had been running for 3 years, disguised as a research study on multilingual cognitive processing. Out of roughly 600,000 people who had participated in the study, he was one of 4 individuals whose bioelectric output patterns showed any significant variability in the relevant frequency ranges. He was the only one of the 4 who was also a linguist, who had already been working on the Velaric translation project for 8 months, who had spent the last 3 years of his career studying emergent alien communication paradigms. And he was the only one who, after 16 months of targeted neurological training using a process that I can only describe as extraordinarily precise biofeedback, combined with things I'm not qualified to explain, could produce a bioelectric output that the Velarath sensors registered as an emotional broadcast. It wasn't perfect. The Contact Bureau specialists were honest about that. His broadcast was blunt compared to Velarath native output, like a hand-drawn map compared to satellite imaging. But it was real. It was there. And it was, crucially, honest because Declan wasn't performing an emotional state, he was generating it genuinely, which the Velarath sensors could apparently distinguish. He could speak Velaric, not fluently, not beautifully, but accurately and honestly, with the truth weight attached. There was only one human being on Earth who could stand in a room with a Velarath delegation and hold a real conversation. And that human being also held, in a biometrically sealed authorization chain that we spent 4 months building from scratch, the launch authority for Contingency Epic Protocol, Earth's last resort defense option, a coordinated simultaneous response involving every functional weapons platform the planet's militaries had quietly unified under the Secretariat's strategic command over the previous 7 years. Those 2 facts lived in the same body, and that was not an accident. Let me tell you about the logic, because I know how it sounds. I know it sounds like a committee somewhere made a terrifying decision and dressed it up in bureaucratic language, and I'm not going to pretend that's entirely wrong. But let me tell you about the logic anyway. The Threat Assessment Division's central concern, the fear that drove every contingency plan we built in those 22 months, was not that the Velarath would come to destroy us. The signal analysis, the preliminary communication exchange, everything we'd received suggested a civilization that had, somewhere in its deep history, made the turn away from conquest. They had the power to glass this planet from orbit. They hadn't. They had the reach to have found us centuries earlier. They'd waited. The pattern of their behavior suggested restraint, careful, considered, almost philosophical restraint. The fear was subtler than an attack. The fear was miscommunication. A civilization that old, that powerful, that alien in its fundamental biology and perceptual framework. The margin for catastrophic misunderstanding in a face-to-face meeting was assessed as significant. Not because the Velarath were hostile, because we were small and new and couldn't fully imagine the ways in which our own signals might read to them as threatening, offensive, or simply baffling in ways that their culture had strong historical responses to. And the secondary fear, the one the Threat Assessment Division only wrote down in the most restricted annexes, was what we might call the interpreter problem. If the one human who could speak to the Velarath directly was a pure diplomat, a person whose only tool was language, then that person had no real leverage in the room. They could translate, negotiate, finesse. But if something went catastrophically wrong, if the Velarath sensors picked up something they couldn't parse and their own contingency systems activated, our translator would have no response available beyond words. Words that, in a crisis moment, might take too long. What the Secretariat built, the thing I was brought in to watch over, was a single human being who was simultaneously the bridge and the wall. Who could reach across with genuine warmth and genuine honesty, because that's what Velaric required. You couldn't lie in it, not really, not if the bioelectric component was active. Who could say we come in peace and mean it in every layer of the language. And who could, if necessary, end a war before it started. That was contingency epic protocol, not an attack, a deterrent. A message the Velarath could not misread. We know you could destroy us, and we want you to know that we would not simply absorb that. Not because we want to fight, but because we want you to know we are real, we are here, we deserve to be considered. The protocol was never meant to fire. It was meant to exist, to be real, to be in the room. And it was in the room because it was in Declan. Part 2, the delegation arrives. They came in June. I know that sounds mundane. A month. June. Like I'm going to say they arrived on a Tuesday, which I am actually. A Tuesday in June, early morning, the sky over Geneva doing that particular thing it does in summer where the light looks almost liquid, pouring over the mountains and pooling in the streets of the old city. The landing was not in Geneva. The landing was at a specially constructed facility 60 kilometers outside the city, in a valley that had been evacuated under cover of an environmental protection initiative 6 months earlier. The facility was designed with Velarath atmospheric requirements in mind, slightly elevated nitrogen content, temperature ranges that ran cooler than human comfort-specific lighting spectrums that the Contact Bureau's preliminary exchanges had indicated the Velarath found non-irritating. The ship was smaller than I expected. I don't know why. I knew the delegation was 11 individuals. I knew the Velarath didn't need to bring a military vessel for a diplomatic contact. I had been briefed on the approximate dimensions. But when you're standing in a valley in Switzerland watching something descend from the upper atmosphere, and it's clearly not from here, your brain does its own thing with scale. It kept trying to make it larger. My eyes kept insisting it should be bigger. It wasn't. It was roughly the size of a regional passenger aircraft, maybe slightly longer, and shaped in a way that made the eye want to slide off it. Not invisible, just geometrically uncomfortable, like a shape that occupied three-dimensional space, but had been designed by someone who thought in 4 dimensions and was making a concession. It landed silently. That was the first thing. No engine sound, no roar, no the ground is shaking under my boots. Just a descent and then the fact of landing. I was standing with the secondary diplomatic team, about 200 meters from the receiving position. The primary delegation, the Secretary General, the senior ambassadors, the cultural liaison team, were positioned closer. Declan was at the front of the contact line, which looked to the Velarath delegation presumably like he was a senior protocol officer, which he was, among many other things. The hatch opened. Velarath physiology. I had seen photographs and the Contact Bureau's preliminary biological assessment. That's different from seeing them. The first delegate out was tall. I would later learn she was at the lower end of Velarath height, which made the tallest human in our delegation look like a child standing next to a parent. Her proportions were close enough to humanoid that you could follow them, your brain building comprehension by mapping onto what it knew. But then each individual element was wrong in ways that accumulated. The limbs had an extra bend in them, subtle but there, like they were conserving motion differently. The torso was long and the shoulders were set wider. The head was held differently, not forward as a human holds their head, but slightly back and high, which in human body language reads as pride or arrogance, but which the Bureau's team had told us was neutral relaxed posture for Velarath. The skin, or the outer layer, the Bureau's biologists weren't certain it was analogous to skin, was a deep gray blue that shifted slightly in the light. Catching it and releasing it in patterns that we eventually understood were partly involuntary chromatic response and partly communicative. They were, in some sense, broadcasting information through their surface. It was deeply disconcerting the first time you noticed it, because it meant they were talking even when they weren't talking, and you had no idea what they were saying. The eyes were the thing people always mentioned. 3 irises, concentric, each capable of independent movement. The outer iris was silver, the middle one was amber. The inner one, the one closest to the pupil, shifted color depending on, as we later learned, a combination of emotional state and ambient light response. When she was calm, it was a cool green. When she was engaged or curious, it shifted toward a warmer gold. She was wearing what the Bureau's protocol team had prepared us for as diplomatic Velarath attire, structured, formal, layered, with embedded panels that seemed to amplify the chromatic signaling from the skin beneath. It moved when she moved in a way that wasn't quite how fabric moves. She walked to the receiving line and she stopped, and she looked at the assembled humans with those 3 iris eyes, and the chromatic patterns on her skin did something complex and rapid that none of us could read, and then she spoke. Velaric is not a language you hear, or it's not only a language you hear. The auditory component comes through, yes, there are sounds, and they resolve into syllables and words if you know what you're listening for. But underneath the auditory layer is the harmonic component, which you feel more than hear, a kind of resonance in the sternum and throat, a vibration that bypasses the ears and registers somewhere older in the nervous system. And then there's the bioelectric component, which you don't perceive at all directly, but which Declan had told me he experienced as a kind of pressure of knowing, a certainty that arose alongside the words, independent of their content, that told you something about the state of the speaker. She said her name, she said where she came from. She said, and Declan translated this in a low voice to the Secretary General beside him, keeping his face forward and his hands loose at his sides, that she was grateful for the preparation this place had received, and that she recognized the effort behind it, and that she considered the effort itself to be a statement of welcome that was not diminished by the imperfections of the preparation. Which means she noticed the nitrogen imbalance, Declan said quietly, still not turning his head, and she's graciously not making it a problem. The Secretary General, to her enormous credit, did not react visibly. The delegate's name, the Velaric approximation of it, the sounds that were closest to what humans could produce, was something like Velaris Thorin Ohm. Declan's transcription, which he worked on during the transit from the landing facility to the summit complex, rendered it phonetically as Velaris, with a stress pattern that suggested the final syllable carried significance, like a marker of rank or lineage. The Bureau's protocol team had told us to use shortened names, as that was apparently standard Velarath practice in cross-culture interactions. So she was Thorin, or we called her Thorin. Whether she called herself that in her own mind, none of us could say. The convoy from the landing facility to the summit complex took 40 minutes. Declan and Thorin were in the same vehicle for the second leg of the transit, along with 2 Velarath secondary delegates and 2 of the Bureau's protocol officers. I was in the vehicle immediately behind, watching through the partition window that had been left with a narrow gap, as per the observation protocol I was operating under. This is when I first saw what I would see for the next 72 hours, the thing that made Declan's situation so specifically, quietly devastating. She talked to him, not through him, not at the human delegation through him as a conduit. She turned slightly in her seat. Velarath weren't built for vehicle seating, and she looked both composed and subtly uncomfortable, the way you'd look if someone asked you to sit in a chair that was 2 sizes too small, and she spoke to Declan directly, addressing him, looking at him. He answered, in Velaric, with the harmonics that the acoustic equipment in the vehicle was recording, and the bioelectric component that the sensors embedded in the headrests were reading. And the chromatic patterns on her skin shifted from the formal diplomatic register they'd held since landing, regular, controlled, appropriate, into something looser. something that the Bureau's senior analyst, reviewing the footage later, described as conversational warmth. Like watching someone in a formal meeting let their shoulders drop slightly once the camera's turned off. She was relaxed with him. She trusted him. I watched this through a 4-centimeter gap in a partition window, and I thought about what was in his jacket pocket. The biometric authorization unit, a device the size and shape of a small tablet that he carried with him at all times during the summit, and I thought, she has no idea. She has no idea at all. The summit complex was a former research facility that the Secretariat had repurposed over the course of a year. I won't give the precise location. What I can say is that it sat at a moderate elevation in a mountain region, that the air outside was clean and cold in the mornings, and that it was surrounded by security infrastructure of a density that I think would have alarmed even the people responsible for protecting heads of state, if they'd known exactly why it was there. The official security perimeter was for the diplomatic delegation's protection, standard summit protocol. The unofficial security perimeter was to ensure that if anything went catastrophically wrong inside the building, the consequences stayed inside the building. Or as much as anything can stay contained in the modern world, which is not very much, but you try. I was quartered in a room on the 3rd floor, second door from the stairwell, which was not an accident. Declan was quartered on the 2nd floor, and my position gave me a sightline to his door and a 6-second response time to his room if the alert on my secondary comm unit activated. We had worked together for 4 months before the summit. We weren't friends. The protocol didn't allow for friendship, not exactly. There was too much asymmetry in what we each knew and what we were each permitted to show. But we had established something, a working understanding, a kind of professional trust that was closer to friendship than either of us admitted. On the first night, after the preliminary reception and the Bureau's debrief, I knocked on his door at 11:15. He opened it immediately, which meant he hadn't been sleeping. "How's the room?" I said. It was not what I was asking. "Fine," he said. It was not what he was answering. He stepped back to let me in. The room was tidy in the particular way of someone who maintains order as a stress response. His translation notes were spread across the desk in 3 separate stacks, each with a different colored marker system that I had learned to read over the months. Blue for confirmed, red for uncertain, green for Velaric terms that had no human equivalent and had been rendered in temporary approximations that he was still working on. There was a lot of green. "She asked me about Earth's oceans," he said, sitting on the edge of the desk. "During the transit, she had questions about the water temperature variance and whether the marine biology varied significantly by region." "She's a scientist," I said. "She's a linguist," he said. "The ocean questions were small talk. The Velarath do small talk. I wasn't expecting that." He rubbed the knuckle of his thumb against his lower lip. She's curious, genuinely, not performing curiosity. The bioelectric is there when she asks questions and it's real." I watched him and nothing, he said, then, "and she sounds like she actually wants to be here, like she actually wants this to work." "That's good," I said carefully. "Yes," he said. He looked at the desk, at the notes, at the green markers. "It's very good." Neither of us said the rest of it out loud. That the better she wanted it to work, the more horrifying it was that the man she was talking to in her own language, with his own emotional truth weight present in every word, the man she was learning to trust, was carrying in his pocket the authority to commence a response that would, at minimum, set the relationship between their civilizations back by decades, and at maximum, end this planet as a viable diplomatic partner before the summit's 72 hours concluded. We didn't say that. We said goodnight and I went back to my room and I didn't sleep for most of the night, which was fine, because neither did he. Part 3, What Happens in the Middle of Things. The first formal session was scheduled for 9 in the morning on the second day. The summit room was rectangular, which the Bureau's protocol team had agonized over. Velarath deliberation spaces were apparently circular, and the choice of rectangle was going to read as something to the delegation, though the team's best analysis was that it would read as human default preference rather than deliberate statement. Circular would have read as humans trying too hard to accommodate, which, in Velarath diplomatic culture, carried its own negative connotations about the sincerity of the host party. We couldn't win on shape, so we made the rectangle as neutral as possible. The lighting was modified. The chairs on the Velarath side were custom fabricated based on the physical dimensions from the Bureau's preliminary biological assessment. The air handling system was maintaining the adjusted nitrogen level, somewhat better than it had been at the landing facility. There was no food in the room. Velarath food customs were complicated enough that the protocol team had decided to handle nutrition breaks separately and bilaterally, which was a polite way of saying each delegation would eat in different rooms, and the question of whether to share a meal was being deferred to later in the summit if everything went well. I was in the observation position, a room adjacent to the summit room, with a one-way acoustic and visual monitoring setup. The biometric link to Declan's authorization unit was active on the secondary display in front of me. It showed, in simple terms, that the unit was present, that its status was nominal, and that its activation threshold had not been reached. Activation threshold, that's what we called it. What it meant was, the analysis systems embedded in the monitoring network were continuously evaluating every input available to them. The Velarath delegation's posture and chromatic output, the acoustic profile of the room, the translation data from Declan's earpiece feed, the security perimeter status from the exterior teams, and 6 other data streams I was cleared to know about, and 3 I wasn't. And if those systems assessed that a defined set of crisis conditions had been met. The authorization unit in Declan's pocket would alert him. Just alert him, the decision was always his. The analysis could not initiate the protocol, only he could. That was the line we had drawn and redrawn in every planning meeting until it was a groove in the table. The machine could watch. The man decided. It was a line drawn partly out of ethics and partly out of necessity, because the protocol required the bioelectric authentication layer, and only Declan could provide that, which meant even if we'd wanted to move the decision-making authority away from him, we couldn't. He was the lock and the key both. Thorin was the second delegate into the room, following the Velarath delegation's senior official, a figure the Bureau had designated senior delegate, whose Velaric designation translated approximately as something between elder speaker and one who carries the accumulated voice. His name sounds rendered as something like Keitharin. He was older than Thorin in ways that were visible in the texture of his outer layer, a slightly different quality of the chromatic pattern, a movement that was not slow but suggested it had, somewhere in the past, been faster. Thorin was his junior, not an aide. Her role was something between specialist and second chair, a position the Bureau's cultural analysts thought might be analogous to a senior counsel or a scientific advisor brought into a diplomatic context. Her specific designation in the Velarath hierarchy was a term the Bureau had been wrestling with for weeks, because its closest human approximation was something like voice truthkeeper, a person whose function was to verify the honesty and accuracy of the communication going on around them. She was, in other words, a professional reader of truth weight. She was in the room to watch for lies. And she was talking to the one man in the room who had the most reasons to conceal the truth, and who could not conceal it because the language he was speaking wouldn't let him. That's the thing about Declan's situation that I turn over at 3 in the morning. He couldn't lie to her, not in Velaric, not with the bioelectric component active. When he said we want peace, he meant it, and she could feel that he meant it. When he said this delegation represents the hope of our world, he was generating that emotion genuinely, because he believed it genuinely, and she was reading that belief in real time. He was the most honest person in the room. He was also the most dangerous. Both of those things were true at the same time, and neither of them canceled the other out. The first session ran for 4 hours. I will not go into the diplomatic content in detail. Most of it remains classified, and the portions that have been released are available in the public record of the Velarath Convergence Summit. What I can tell you is what I observed from the monitoring position. What it looked like, moment to moment, as the morning moved forward. Keitharin spoke mostly to the Secretary General. The dynamic between them was formal and careful in the way that senior diplomats are formal and careful, each word placed precisely, each pause meaningful, each acknowledgement measured. Declan translated in both directions, sitting at the corner of the table that allowed him to maintain line of sight with both parties. His Velaric rendering of the Secretary General's positions was, I could tell from the analysis feed's acoustic assessment, technically precise, the harmonics correct, the emotional truth weight present and consistent with what the Secretary General was expressing. He was translating not just the words but the intention, and doing it honestly. But in the gaps, in the moments when Keith Aaron and the Secretary General were consulting with their respective teams, those small pauses that happen in every meeting when someone leans sideways to hear something from an advisor, when the room breathes for a moment, Thorin would speak. Not to her delegation's senior official, not to the Secretary General. To Declan, she would lean slightly across the corner of her seat, that awkward accommodating lean of someone in a chair designed for a different body, and she would say something in Velaric, low and quick, the auditory component almost casual, and he would answer, and the feed on my screen would show her chromatic output shifting into the warmer tones of conversational engagement, the middle iris moving toward gold. I had a partial transcription feed from Declan's earpiece. Partial because some of the exchanges were too quick and the acoustic pickup wasn't perfect for the angles. What I had. Thorin, your rendering of the secondary delegate's concern about resource jurisdiction, the word you used carries a weight of anxiety. Is that accurate or is that a translation artifact? Declan, accurate. There's genuine concern in the delegation about the jurisdictional question. I'm not softening it. Pause. Thorin, I appreciate that. Your truth weight is consistent. She was checking him. Session by session, exchange by exchange, she was running verification passes on his translation. Listening to the emotional truth weight, he was generating and cross-referencing it with the content of his words to ensure they matched. And they did match every time. Because he was telling the truth. Because he couldn't help it in that language, with his nervous system doing what it had been trained to do. What she couldn't verify was the truth he wasn't saying. Day 2. There were 3 sessions. The morning session ran long past the scheduled break because a point of navigational jurisdiction, something about the heliosphere boundary and the definition of protected space relative to the Velarath's established patrol routes, became unexpectedly complex. Not hostile, just complex. The kind of complexity that arises when 2 civilizations discover that they have been using the same region of space for different purposes, without realizing the other was there. I watched Declan work through it. He sat at his corner of the table and he translated the Secretary General's careful, legalistic position into Velaric, and then translated Keith Aaron's response, which was longer, more layered, carrying more harmonic weight, back into English, and he found the words each time, not perfect words. He would pause sometimes, his thumb knuckle at his lower lip, and I could see him working through a Velaric term that didn't have a clean English equivalent, finding the closest approximation, and then flagging it explicitly to the Secretary General. This word carries about 3 meanings, and I'm giving you the primary one, but we should come back to the secondary meaning. He was a good translator. I don't want to lose that in everything else. He was a genuinely good translator, and what made him good was not just the neurological training. It was that he actually cared about accuracy. He was not trying to smooth things over. He was not trying to make the human side sound better than it was, or make the Velarath positions sound more accommodating than they were. He was trying to take a true thing from one language and put it into another language and have it arrive true on the other end, which made what he was carrying all the more strange to witness. The second session of Day 2 was the one where I first understood that Thorin had moved past professional verification into something else. It was late afternoon. The light through the summit room's modified windows was shifting, going amber. The formal session had concluded, and there was a 30-minute transition period scheduled before the informal discussion that the Bureau's protocol team optimistically called a cultural exchange segment. In practice, this meant everyone milled around slightly awkwardly, while the room's configuration was adjusted, and refreshment arrangements were handled for each delegation separately. Declan was at the side of the room, reviewing his notes. Thorin crossed to him. She moved differently outside a formal session. The careful, deliberate pace she kept in her seat gave way to something more fluid and direct, the long Velarath stride covering distance efficiently. She came to stand beside him, and she looked at the notes on his tablet, printed in his combination of phonetic Velaric transcription and English annotation, and she said something. He looked up. She said it again, and this time I caught enough of the acoustic pickup to follow part of it. Thorin, these marks. Do you use different marks for different, untranscribed harmonic segment, categories of truth weight. She was asking about his notation system. She had looked at his notes, and she had asked about his notation system. And Declan, I watched him do it, said, "Yes, blue for things I'm confident I've rendered accurately, red for things I'm uncertain about, where my translation might not fully carry the original meaning, green for concepts that don't have an equivalent in the receiving language." She looked at the notes again. She reached out and touched, not quite touched, stopped with her hand just short of the tablet's surface, in a gesture the Bureau's cultural analysis would later identify as a request for permission, and he turned the tablet slightly toward her. She looked at the green marks. There was a lot of green on those pages. "These are the ones that have no equivalent," she said. "You mark them to remember they might arrive wrong." "Yes," he said. "That is," she said, and the chromatic pattern on her skin did something brief and complex that I couldn't read from the monitoring feed. "A very careful thing to do. Most, harmonic segment, do not mark what might be lost. They assume the arrival is faithful." "I don't like assuming," he said. She looked at him for a moment with those concentric irises, the middle one at full gold, and then she said something I caught very clearly on the feed, something that landed in my chest like a dropped stone. "I believe you. Not I can verify you, not the truth weight confirms." She said, "I believe you," the same way a person says it to another person when they've moved past checking and into something more fundamental. She trusted him. She had moved from professional verification into trust. And I sat in the monitoring room and watched it happen, and I didn't move, didn't react, just held the biometric display in my peripheral vision where the authorization unit's status read nominal, nominal, nominal in its small green letters. And I thought about what trust does to a room and what trust costs, and what it means to receive something you can't fully return. Part 4, the weight of what he carried. That night, the second night, the night before the final session, Declan came to me. Not a knock on my door, a message on the secure comm, "Can you walk?" Which meant, I need to be outside and I need someone with me. We walked the perimeter of the facility's inner security zone. The night was cold, mountain cold, the stars doing what they do at elevation, sharp and dense and very present. There were guards stationed at intervals, and I could see the subtle posture adjustments they made as we passed, the way they tracked us without appearing to. The authorization unit was on Declan's person. It was always on his person. He would have been recalled from this walk immediately if he'd tried to leave without it. We walked for a few minutes without talking. Then he said, "She asked me today why humans mark things." Mark things. Monuments, borders, graves. She'd been reviewing. Apparently the Velarath preparation for this contact involved a lot of study of human behavior. And one of the things that had puzzled her delegation was the degree to which humans mark physical space to record what happened there. She said in Velaric culture, the equivalent function is carried in the communal memory through a kind of, there's a word. It sounds roughly like Kethavar. It's in my green category, closest approximation is maybe living archive or carried memory weight. They don't mark places, they mark each other. I thought about that. What did you tell her? I told her that for humans, the place helps us remember. That being in a location activates memory of what happened there. That we mark the spot so the memory stays accessible even for people who weren't there. He paused, the stars were doing their thing. She said that sounded, the Velaric term she used was beautifully impermanent, which I think was a compliment. I'm not entirely sure. There was a harmonic layer I might have missed. We walked a few more steps. She's going to recommend the accord, he said. I can tell. The truth weight when she talks about the outcome of this summit, there's something in it that reads like decision already made. She came here wanting this to work, and she's going to leave saying it did. I said nothing. Yusuf, he said, he used my first name rarely, only when the professional framing was in the way of something that needed to be said directly. If this had gone wrong, if the threshold had been reached, I need to. Don't, I said. I need to say it once, he said. He stopped walking. I stopped. The nearest guard was about 40 meters away, facing outward. If the protocol had activated, if I'd had to use it, she would have died. Not immediately, not directly, I'm not, he stopped, breathed. But whatever came after, whatever response a civilization their age would send to a planet that initiated an epic protocol response against their diplomatic delegation, she would not survive it. None of them would. Declan, and she trusts me, he said. She has been sitting across from me for 2 days, and she has been checking my truth weight, and she has concluded that I am honest. And I am honest. Every single thing I have said to her in Velaric has been true, every word, every harmonic. I have not deceived her once. He turned to face me. In the mountain dark his face was all shadows and the sharp altitude light. And she has absolutely no idea, he said, that the honest man she's been trusting to carry her words faithfully has been sitting 4 feet from her with the authority to make her world send a fleet. I didn't answer. There wasn't an answer, not a real one. He started walking again after a moment. I walked beside him. I know why it had to be this way, he said. I've understood the logic from the beginning. If the deterrent is real, if the authority is real, then the honesty of everything else that surrounds it is also real. She can feel that I mean it when I say we want peace. She can feel it because I do. The protocol doesn't make that a lie. It's not a lie. He rubbed the knuckle of his left thumb against his lower lip. I just needed to say it out loud, he said, once to someone who knows what it means. We finished the walk. We went back inside. He went to his room and I went to mine, and I lay on my bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about the specific shape of what he was carrying. Not the weight of power, which I think is survivable if you're the right kind of person, but the weight of honest power that cannot explain itself, which is a different thing entirely. He couldn't tell her, not because the protocol was classified, though it was, but because there was no Velaric word for it. There was no way to render it in a language where the truth weight was always present and always legible, where saying I carry a thing that could harm you would arrive in her nervous system not as information, but as threat. The green marks on his notes, the concepts that had no equivalent, the things that might be lost in translation no matter how carefully you tried. The authorization unit wasn't in any language she could read. Part 5, the morning of the 3rd day. The final session was scheduled for 10 in the morning. At 7:43, my comm unit activated. Not the standard alert, the secondary one. The alert that had a different tone, lower and sustained, that I had trained myself over 4 months to hear and respond to in under 3 seconds. I was out of bed and moving before I was fully awake. In the corridor, 3 security personnel already repositioned, which meant the automated monitoring system had also flagged it. The biometric display on my secure comm was showing the authorization unit's status as threshold proximity, not activated, which meant the analysis systems had detected a convergence of crisis indicators sufficient to alert, but had not yet assessed a full crisis threshold breach. I was at Declan's door in 6 seconds. He opened it before I knocked. He was dressed, he'd been awake. The authorization unit was in his hand, not activated, but in his hand, which told me everything about what the past however long had been. External perimeter, he said. East quadrant, 3 unauthorized thermal signatures. Analysis says Velarath biosignature. That stopped me. Velarath, not human. Not human. He looked at the unit in his hand. 3 individuals outside the security perimeter on the eastern approach. They weren't on the delegation manifest. They didn't come in on the ship. The monitoring team has been trying to determine how they got there for, he checked his watch, 11 minutes. I activated my earpiece and got the security channel. The perimeter commander's voice was careful and controlled in the professional way that means the opposite of calm. Can't raise them on any channel. The bioreaders confirm Velarath pattern physiology. They're not moving, just holding position approximately 200 meters outside the marker. What's the analysis reading? I asked. Analysis is running multiple scenarios. The perimeter commander's voice tightened slightly. The top 3 are surveillance team, safety escort, or advanced deterrent unit. We can't distinguish between those scenarios yet. An advanced deterrent unit, which is military language for they brought backup that they didn't tell us about, which is diplomatic language for one side of this negotiation was prepared for things to go wrong in ways they didn't share. Which is when the other side is carrying contingency epic protocol, an extremely delicate situation. The analysis system had seen the signature of 3 Velarath of unknown function stationed outside our perimeter while their diplomatic delegation slept, and it had seen the human response building, security personnel moving to alert positions, weapon systems going to standby, the monitoring network accelerating its threat assessment. and it had calculated that the convergence of those two facts was approaching a threshold. Not because either side was acting aggressively, because two parties, both carrying contingencies they hadn't disclosed, were getting closer to discovering each other. I looked at Declan. He was already thinking. I could see it, the thumb knuckle wasn't at his lip. Both hands were still, which meant he'd moved past the working through stage and into something more decisive. I need to wake her, he said. The protocol. Not as an act, not under the protocol. I need to wake Thorin, and I need to explain what's happening because she's the voice truthkeeper, and if her delegation wakes up to a full security response without any communication, the interpretation problem gets significantly worse. He looked at me. You know I'm right. I did know he was right. I also knew it was outside the protocol framework we'd been operating in. I also knew that the protocol framework had been designed for a different kind of crisis scenario. If you go to her room, I said carefully, and you explain what's happening, she's going to hear truth weight in every word you say. Yes. Which means if she asks you anything beyond what's relevant to the immediate situation, the truth weight is live. You can't modulate it for a specific subject. He looked at me steadily. I know. Declan, I know, he said again. I'm going to go explain what's happening to the only person in this building who can communicate with the individuals outside our perimeter. I'm going to explain it honestly, and whatever she reads in my truth weight, I'm going to trust that she understands peace well enough to interpret correctly. I stared at him for a moment. You're trusting her, I said. She's been trusting me for 2 days, he said. It's the only honest response I have. He left his room. I followed. Thorin's room was on the other end of the second floor, behind the Velarath delegation's protocol-designated security space. The Velarath guard on the corridor, a secondary delegate who had the physical build and particular stillness of someone trained for security, tracked us from the moment we came around the corner. Declan raised one hand, palm outward, which the Bureau's cultural team had confirmed was a Velarath signal for I come without intent to act. He spoke to the guard in Velaric. Low and clear, the harmonics present the bioelectric running. The guard looked at him for a long moment, then stepped aside. Declan knocked on Thorin's door. She answered quickly, which suggested she had also been awake. She was in whatever the Velarath equivalent of casual dress was still formal by human standards, but without the diplomatic panels, the chromatic signaling amplification. Her skin's natural patterns were visible and unmagnified, and they were doing something complex and quick that I recognized from 48 hours of watching, as the pattern she ran when she was surprised and processing rapidly. She looked at Declan. She looked at me. She looked at the authorization unit he was still holding. He hadn't put it away, and I saw the moment she saw it, the moment her 3 iris eyes tracked to it and the middle iris went to full gold. He spoke to her in Velaric. I don't have the exact transcription from that moment. I was there, but the monitoring system's acoustic pickup was not positioned for the corridor, and my Velaric was survival level at best. What I can give you is what I understood from watching and what he told me afterward. He told her there were 3 individuals outside the perimeter, that they carried Velarath biosignatures, that they had not been on the manifest, that the human security system had detected them and was currently in a state of alert. That he had come to her directly, before any other action, because he believed she was the right person to communicate with if communication was possible, and because he believed that the next 10 to 15 minutes were a window in which the situation could be resolved without escalation if the right voice reached the right people. He told her the human side was on alert. He told her his own monitoring function had been activated. He told her, and this is the part I think about most, that he was not going to pretend the situation was less serious than it was, because she would hear it in the truth weight if he tried to minimize it, and because she deserved to know accurately what was happening. And then he said, the decision about how to proceed is yours and your delegations to make. But I am telling you first, before my own superiors have been formally briefed, because I trust your judgment. She listened to all of this without moving. The chromatic patterns on her skin were rapid and layered in ways I couldn't read. The middle iris was full gold throughout. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked him one question. I got this part from him later, in the debrief that he and I conducted privately before the formal record went up. He was careful about language. the way he always was, finding the right word and checking it before he committed. She asked him, "The thing you carry, the device in your hand, is it related to what is outside our perimeter?" And he could not lie in Velaric. He could not separate his words from his truth weight. The language wouldn't let him. He said, not directly, but it is related to the same concern. She absorbed that. The chromatic patterns ran something long and slow across her skin. She said, "You came to tell me before acting." He said, "Yes." She said, "The thing you carry, would its use prevent or accelerate harm?" He said, "My intention is that it never be used. That has been my intention from the beginning. I am telling you that with full truth weight present." Another long pause. She said, "I believe you." And then she said, "I will speak to the three outside." What happened in the next 40 minutes? Thorin woke Keitharin. She explained the situation. I don't know how, I don't know what she said. But I know that when the senior Velarath delegate emerged from his room, he moved with the purposeful calm of someone who had been briefed completely, and was ready to act on the information rather than someone who had been startled into crisis. She went to the communications equipment that the Velarath delegation had brought, their own technology, which we had agreed to allow within the summit complex, which we had agreed to allow because refusing would have read as profound distrust, and she made contact with the three individuals outside the perimeter. Declan sat with me in the corridor and listened to the Velaric exchange, and translated quietly in real time. "Safety escort," he said after the first minute. "They came with the delegation but held outside as a precaution. Standard Velarath diplomatic protocol for first contact situations. Keep a response capability outside the contact zone, don't declare it, activate only if the contact team signals. She's telling them the situation is stable. She's telling them they've been detected, but that the detection is not a hostile act." He paused, listening. "She's telling them," he said slowly, "that the human delegation has been transparent with her about the security response. She's describing it as," he paused longer this time, working through something, "as a demonstration of intent to communicate rather than conceal. She's presenting it as evidence of good faith." He looked at me. He said, and he stopped and rubbed the knuckle of his thumb across his lower lip. "She's defending us, to her own backup team. She's characterizing the moment I woke her up and showed her the authorization unit as an act of honesty." I thought about that, about how Thorin had processed those 48 hours of truth weight, session by session, exchange by exchange, and had built from it a conclusion about Declan's character substantial enough that, when he woke her in the early morning with an authorization unit in his hand and fear, sitting quietly in every layer of his Velaric, she had decided to trust the fear rather than fear the trust. She had decided he was telling the truth, not just about the immediate situation, about the whole of it. The safety escort withdrew. Thorin spoke with the perimeter commander, through Declan, formally, carefully, with every word translated and every truth weight legible, and confirmed the identities and peaceful function of the three individuals. The security alert was downgraded. The authorization unit's display shifted from threshold proximity back to nominal. By 9:15, 47 minutes after my comm unit had activated, the facility was at standard status. The final session began at 10, as scheduled. Part 6, the accord and after. Thorin did not change how she spoke to Declan in the final session. That's the thing I want to record clearly, because I think it would be easy to assume that the early morning incident had changed the dynamic, that she was more guarded, or more watchful, or that the warmth of the previous 2 days had been replaced by something more careful and professional. It hadn't. She was the same, leaning across the corner of her seat during the pauses. Asking him about his notation system, about the green marks, about what concepts he was still uncertain how to carry. Watching him with the middle iris at gold when she thought he wasn't looking, which he probably was. She had processed what she'd learned about him and integrated it and arrived at a conclusion, and the conclusion wasn't this man is dangerous. The conclusion was something closer to what Declan had said to me the night before, walking in the mountain cold. The honest man she'd been trusting was honest. Even the part of him that carried something she couldn't fully name was honest about carrying it. The Velarath value honesty that completely. It is the organizing principle of their diplomatic culture in a way that human diplomatic culture has never quite managed. You can read all the analyses the Bureau produced and understand it intellectually, but watching it in practice, watching Thorin decide that Declan's willingness to show her the device was more important than what the device represented, was different from understanding it. She had checked his truth weight for 2 days and found it consistent, and she had decided that consistency was the real data. Everything else was context. The Velarath Convergence Accord was signed, or rather, ratified in the Velarath manner, which involved a formal bioelectric exchange between Keitharin and the Secretary-General conducted through Declan as relay. The Secretary-General's hand on Declan's shoulder and Declan's hands extended toward Keitharin, the bioelectric signal passing through him, at 2:47 in the afternoon on the 3rd day. It established the heliospheric boundary framework. It opened a formal communication channel between Earth and Velarath diplomatic systems. It committed both civilizations to a structured series of exchanges over the following decade. And it included, in its 47th article, a clause that the Velarath delegation had proposed, and the human side had taken 6 hours of private consultation to accept. Both parties acknowledged that each entered this contact carrying capabilities and contingencies not fully disclosed to the other. Both parties acknowledged this as consistent with reasonable civilizational caution. Both parties commit that in future contacts, the practice of early disclosure, the act of showing what one carries before being asked, shall be considered a demonstration of intent toward peace, and shall be received as such. Article 47. The Bureau's legal team had gone very quiet when it was first proposed. Then the Secretary-General had called Declan in for a private consultation that lasted 40 minutes. When they came back, the Secretary-General agreed. The article was Thorin's proposal. She had proposed it, Declan told me later, using a Velaric formulation that translated approximately as "this is the principle that has already been demonstrated here, and we believe it should be named so that it can be carried forward." She was marking the place, the way she'd said humans do to make the memory accessible for people who weren't there. She was marking what had happened in the corridor at 7:43 in the morning, when a man woke her up and showed her an authorization unit he couldn't explain, and she trusted him anyway. She was marking it so it could be carried. The delegation departed the following morning. I was in the outer observation position, farther back this time, not needed at the primary line. The convoy moved from the summit complex to the landing facility, and the ship was prepped, and the diplomatic farewells were conducted with appropriate ceremony. Thorin was the last of the Velarath delegation to board. She stopped at the base of the ramp and turned, the way someone turns when they've thought of something they want to say before the door closes. She looked at Declan. He was standing at the edge of the primary line, the authorization unit no longer in his hand. It had been formally handed off to the Secretariat's custody team the previous evening. His tenure as Supreme Executor of Contingency Epic Protocol concluded the moment the accord was ratified. He was just a linguist now, or he was just a linguist again. She spoke to him. The acoustic pickup from my position wasn't good enough to catch the words. But I could see the chromatic patterns from where I stood, the full warm gold of the middle iris, the slow, complex flow across the outer layer that the Bureau's analysts had begun to identify as the Velarath expression that most closely mapped onto the human word gratitude, though they always noted that it carried additional layers that didn't have an English equivalent. Declan answered her. Whatever he said, it took about 20 seconds. His hands were loose at his sides. His face was the face he had when he was being fully honest, not performing calm, not managing an impression, just present and real and true. She looked at him for another moment. Then she boarded. I asked him later, weeks later, back in the Bureau's offices in Geneva, the summit a memory and the accord in ratification, and the world outside doing its strange, ongoing thing of processing the reality of what had changed, what he'd said to her. He thought about it for a moment. I told her the green marks in my notes, he said. The ones for concepts that don't translate. I told her that the thing I carried during the summit was one of those, that it existed in a category that Velaric doesn't have a word for, not because the Velarath don't have the concept, but because in Velaric, that category doesn't need a word because the truth weight makes it self-evident. He paused, and I told her that I hoped she had read it correctly, the truth weight, what I carried and why. I told her I hoped it had arrived true on her end. What did she say? I asked. She said he stopped, worked through it, making sure he had the translation right. She said that in Velarath, there is a principle that applies to all cross-civilization contact. It translates roughly as, the weight of what is carried matters less than the manner of carrying it. She said I had carried it in the manner of someone who would prefer not to use it, and that this was. He stopped again, rubbed his knuckle across his lower lip. Kethavar, he said. The word I put in the green category, living archive, carried memory weight. She said this would be her Kethavar of the first contact, not the accord, not the ceremony, the moment in the corridor. He was quiet for a second. She'll carry it, he said. For as long as she carries anything, that's what the word means. Ending. I've been writing this for 3 weeks. I've started it 4 times and thrown out 3 of those starts because they read like official record, and that's not what this is supposed to be. This is supposed to be a witness account. This is supposed to be the kind of thing you write because you were there, and you have to put it somewhere outside yourself, or it just lives in your chest getting heavier. So here's what I want to say at the end of it, the thing I actually want to carry forward. She never knew. Thorin, with her 3 iris eyes and her professional truth-weight reading and her green-marked notes and her warmth that she gave to a man she had decided to believe in, she never knew what he was authorized to do. She knew he carried something. She knew it was significant. She read the emotional weight of it clearly, and she chose to interpret the manner of carrying as more important than the content of what was carried. And she was right. She was correct. The manner was the content, the choice to be transparent, the choice to wake her up, the choice to trust her judgment over his own protocols. That was the real thing in the room. The epic protocol was a deterrent. The trust was the actual event. But she didn't know the specifics. She didn't know that the device in his hand, connected to weapon platforms she didn't know existed. Didn't know the specific catastrophic shape of what might have been necessary. Didn't know the full, terrible geometry of what Earth had been prepared to do. And here is the thought that lives with me at 3 in the morning. The thought that the mountain cold and the stars can't quite resolve. She trusted him without knowing, and the trust was valid. The trust was right. Declan was honest. He did carry peace in every true word he said to her. He did mean what he said when he said we want this to work. The truth weight was real and it was hers to read and she read it correctly. And also there are things that exist in the green category, things without equivalence. Things that might be lost in translation, no matter how careful you are with the green marks, no matter how many times you flag the approximation and go back to check. What Thorin carried forward in her Kethavar was a moment of honest connection between 2 people at the edge of a new world. That's real. That's irreducibly, permanently real. What she could not carry was the full weight of what she didn't know, because you cannot carry what you cannot name. The accord stands. The communication channel is active. The exchanges are proceeding. The heliospheric boundary is being quietly and carefully negotiated by teams who are now working from the foundation that the summit built. Declan is still a linguist. He has 6 pages of green marks from the Velarath convergence that he is still working on, finding better approximations, checking the arrivals. He will probably be working on them for years. He does not carry the authorization unit anymore. That was handed over. That weight has been redistributed through the Secretariat systems in ways that are above my clearance to know. What he still carries, what I think he will carry for a long time, is the particular knowledge of what trust looks like when it is given without full information, and is still, somehow, correct. What it looks like when someone reads your truth weight through a language that won't let you lie, and decides that the honest man is real, even though the honest man is also something else, something with no equivalent in any language either of you speak. She trusted him. She never knew what he held. And I believe this. I'm generating this with whatever emotional truth weight I have in me, which is not bioelectric, but it's what I've got. I think he deserved to be trusted. Even knowing everything, even carrying everything. The weight of what is carried matters less than the manner of carrying it. I hope that's true. I'm marking this here so I don't forget. So the memory stays accessible, even for people who weren't there. End of account, Lieutenant Commander Yusuf Adlan Kowari, Strategic Liaison Division, United Earth Defense Secretariat. Declassified by order of the Joint Galactic Accord Oversight Board, 14 months post-convergence. Addendum appended by the author. The word Kethavar has since been formally incorporated into the Bureau's Valeric lexicon. It is no longer in the green category. It has a definition now, and the definition is this: a memory carried in the body, not the mind, one that shapes how you move through the world rather than merely what you know about it. I think that's right. I think that's close.